welcome to I-24 News Defense, a weekly review of strategic affairs, security, intelligence, and more, in cooperation with Israel Defense magazine. In this edition, we analyze the lessons of Operation Protective Edge 1 month after the sides agreed on a ceasefire. We report on the latest in the war against Daesh and hear about the origins of the motivation driving the leaders of the Islamist terrorist group. Let's begin. As Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the PA Chairman Mahmoud Abbas sparred at the UN General Assembly, dozens of military personnel, retired officers, ministers, and researchers gathered at Israel's National Security Studies Institute to discuss and analyze the implications of Operation Protective Edge. Tal Shalev with the story.
A month after Operation Protective Edge, the global spotlight has moved on from the Gaza war to the Daesh threat. But the aftermath of the 50 days of fighting is far from over. For the third time in 6 years, Israel finds itself looking back at another violent conflict in the Gaza Strip.
We expected a war with Hamas of 20 days. And we found ourselves, after 51 days finishing this operation. The question is, what went wrong over here?
Protective Edge displayed impressive advances in military technology, enabling Israel to withstand thousands of rockets and mortar shells and successfully kill senior Hamas commanders. But Israel was caught off guard regarding the extent of Hamas's tunnel network.
We all knew about the tunnels, but it is quite obvious right now that the meaning of and the threat that came from the tunnels was not known, not expected, and in a way we were surprised.
Even as Israel tried to avoid civilian casualties, it failed, as Hamas purposefully embedded itself among the civilian population, creating a legal headache the day after the war.
Well, I think Protective Edge is yet another example, it's not the first one, of the difficulty of fighting these kinds of wars where the enemy is attacking our civilians and using civilians as the human shields. And how do we, on the one hand, protect ourselves, defend our civilians, and on the other hand, minimize as much as possible harm to civilians when the harm to civilians is one of the methods the other side is using against us.
In recent weeks, the Israeli Prime Minister has repeatedly hinted at a new diplomatic horizon with the moderate Arab states. But life has returned to the pre-operation status quo, and many have doubts about the strategic and diplomatic endgame of this round.
The larger thinking should have been, how do we, together with our regional allies and partners and potential partners, enable us to change the nature of the political relations between Israel and the Palestinians that would lead to the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and not create a new status quo which endangers Israel in the longer term.
The constant threat of fire and assaults hasn't been removed, and the Gaza blockade is yet to be lifted. Hamas might be weakened, but it was not defeated and is not about to disarm. So the lessons of the Gaza war should be examined, preparing for the next round. It's probably not a matter of if, but rather when.
And joining us now from the INSS is Reserve Major General Amos Yadlin, former head of military intelligence of IDF. Good evening, General. Were you satisfied with the dialogue between the military and the political leadership during the operation?
The political echelon have dictated a very limited operation, and I'm not sure whether the military leaders brought to the cabinet some other innovative ideas how to achieve a more ambitious goal, or even this very modest goal of quiet for quiet in a much shorter time with a better result about the coming agreement that we don't know yet whether it is a strategic, positive outcome for Israel, or we are going back to a very problematic strategic relation between Israel and Hamas. The atmosphere was not such that encourage, bring us some new ideas, bring us innovative ideas, bring us alternative strategic goals and modus operandi for the IDF to bring this result, as I say, in a shorter time and excessive and a better result.
Do you think Israel could have achieved more, given its superiority in terms of manpower and weapons?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think the strategic goal of quiet for quiet, based on restoring deterrence and hit Hamas, was not enough. It is very important to look into the future and have a longer, much longer period of quiet and have a very strong deterrence. Both were not achieved in the scenarios that I could imagine the IDF operating in Gaza. Much stronger, much earlier, and in innovative ways and not in a very schematic way.
Major, do you think that the demilitarization of Gaza is a reachable target during negotiations?
It is not a realistic goal if it is a subject to the Hamas agreement. Hamas will never give up its core ideology, which is using terror, using weapons against Israel. So what I'm recommending is agreement with the rest of the international community beside Hamas. And in the middle, in the center of it is Egypt, which will help blocking the smuggling. The international community helping blocking the smuggling in the high seas, in the Gulf, in the Red Sea, where it's coming from Iran, and granting legitimacy for Israel to act against a future build-up in the Gaza Strip.
Now, how fast can Hamas, in your opinion, rebuild its military capabilities?
I think this time the building up of Hamas will be slower because the main pipe of smuggling weapons and all the materials to build weapons is now much narrow. It was narrowed by the operations that the Egyptians have done to block the tunnels of smuggling.
Not to be pessimistic, but do you think the next round is on the doorstep?
Very difficult to judge. There are not prophets around. It has to do a lot with the political arrangement that will be reached or not reached in Cairo. As you remember, within 30 days, negotiations should have been started. They hardly started. We don't know what will be the result. If Gaza will have a program to rebuild it, and Hamas will have a lot to lose in the future, I think the period will be longer. And the other way around. No effective program to limit Hamas, no rebuilding of Gaza, Hamas has nothing to lose. They may go very quickly to another round.
And finally, what can be learned from Operation Protective Edge for a similar operation against Hezbollah in the north?
Yeah, Hezbollah is a different story. Hezbollah has much more formidable capabilities. Israel will have to be much more aggressive in the north. Hezbollah is Lebanon. It's part of the government. So Lebanon has much more to lose compared to Gaza. When Hezbollah will fire the missiles, we have another layer of protective, not only the Iron Dome, but the Arrow. And Israel can find and has a military solution to Hezbollah's threat, but it's a different magnitude of conflict, much harder than the one in Gaza.
Major General Yadlin, thank you for your time.
Good evening to you and to your listeners.
Moving on now to global issues, the fight against Daesh. In northern Iraq, Kurdish forces launched a new front offensive while the Iraqi army claimed gains against the jihadists in Diyala province. Joining us now via Skype from Erbil is Paula Slia, Middle East Bureau Chief. Paula, now that the coalition has become active and airstrikes are underway, what is the status of the Iraqi forces?
Well, I would say that the Iraqi forces are working together with the local militias belonging to various tribes, as well as the Peshmerga forces, which are, of course, your Kurdish fighters. And all indications on the ground here is that they are on the offensive. For example, they control some 80% of the governorate of Diyali, which is northeast of Baghdad. And in the past few days, they have killed more than 100 extremists around the country. That is from the reports we're receiving on the ground here. But an important point needs to be made, and that is that the army is still struggling to curb all of the violence erupting from ISIS. You have car explosions, you have mortar attacks happening almost on a daily basis here in Iraq. And just in the last 48 hours, dozens of people have been killed.
Now, Paula, reports say the Kurdish Peshmerga forces are on the offensive. Are they optimistic concerning any progress?
Well, I'm here in northern Iraq, and I have spent at least a day with the Peshmerga fighters. I went with them to the front line, and we could actually see ISIS just some 3 kilometers from where we were standing. Talking to these fighters, they are very confident, they're very optimistic. They are known for their brutality. They are very grateful for the weapons and ammunition that they're receiving from the international community. There is, however, some dissatisfaction amongst some of the leaders I spoke to. They do feel that they could be provided with more ammunition. And it, of course, begs the question whether or not there should be or will be boots on the ground from the Western community. Not that I was hearing that call from the Peshmerga leaders, but it was certainly something that was put forward on the table. I do also want to make the point that the Peshmerga are receiving assistance from local tribes. And so it does seem as if they have a real chance now to re-establish full control over Kurdish areas.
Thank you, Paula Slia in Erbil. And with us now in the studio is Reserve Colonel Pesach Malovani. I'm not saying that correctly. Malovani, sorry. An independent researcher and a former senior intelligence officer. Good evening.
Good evening, good day.
Thank you for joining us. Recently, you published an article which claims that the origin of the Islamic State, Daesh, actually lies in the Iraqi Saddam forces. Can you elaborate?
I asked myself, as many others in the world, I believe, how comes that this organization, who nobody knew about it before June, last June, is so successful in his military occupations, a great part of Iraq, a great part of Syria, and the Iraqi glorious army that the Americans invested so much efforts to build it, and also the Syrian army, poor army, I would say today, could not fight and stand against them, and they took their, even they left the weapons behind them and fled away. And I found, lastly, information based on Iraqi intelligence sources that they found that most of the leadership and also many fighters of this organization came from what was called in the past Fidai Saddam.
Exactly. So that brings me to my next question. What are the Fidai Saddam?
This was an organization, actually an army. They had a chief of a general staff, and the staff were organized as a military organization with brigades and battalions and even higher level headquarters to fight against rebellion threats, internal threats.
And as you said, as an army, not as a militia.
No, it's an army which is very loyal to the regime, to the Ba'ath party, and to the leader himself. You can see here their emblem. You see, this is Saddam, the profile of Saddam. Here it's written Allah, which means God, the nation, Al-Watan, Al-Qaeda, the leader, and this is the Fedayeen.
And with the famous black background, which may be...
This is the black one, and there is also a white one. This is the Fedayeen. They were established as a lesson of the Intifada, the big rebellion that started in Iraq in the Kurdish and Shiite areas just after the end of the Desert Storm operation in Kuwait. And as a lesson, the regime decided to establish
we
this.
See it's quite similar.
Yes. This organization, many of the commanders of the new Daesh are from there, including the commander.
Exactly, I saw you wrote in your article.
Al-Baghdadi.
Bakr al-Baghdadi served as part of the Fidai
his
brigade.
name is Ibrahim Awad Ibrahim al-Badri, and he's from Samara. So this is actually the roots. They learned there very well how to do all the things they are doing today, because also in those days, everybody who was suspected, they tortured him and killed him and beheaded him. And all what we see today is actually a kind of making again the same things as they did it in the 19th.
Thank you very much, Mr. Molovani, for joining us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have right now. Thank you to our viewers. Be sure to catch us next week for another edition of I24 News Defense. For all the latest headlines, log on to www.i24news.tv. Have a safe night from Jaffa Port. Good night. Welcome to I24 News Defense, a weekly review of strategic affairs, security, intelligence, and more, in cooperation with Israel Defense magazine. In this edition, we analyze the lessons of Operation Protective Edge 1 month after the sides agreed on a ceasefire. We report on the latest in the war against Daesh and hear about the origins of the motivation driving the lead.
Failed, as Hamas purposefully embedded itself among the civilian population, creating a legal headache the day after the war.
Well, I think Protective Edge is yet another example, it's not the first one, of the difficulty of fighting these kinds of wars where the enemy is attacking our civilians and using civilians as the human shields. And how do we, on the one hand, protect ourselves, defend our civilians, and on the other hand, minimize as much as possible harm to civilians when the harm to civilians is one of the methods the other side is using against
Leaders of the Islamist terrorist group. Let's begin. As Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the PA chairman Mahmoud Abbas sparred at the UN General Assembly, dozens of military personnel, retired officers, ministers, and researchers gathered at Israel's National Security Studies Institute to discuss and analyze the implications of Operation Protective Edge. Tal Shalev with the story.
A month after Operation Protective Edge, the global spotlight has moved on from the Gaza war to the Daesh threat. But the aftermath of the 50 days of fighting is far from over. For the third time in 6 years, Israel finds itself looking back at another violent conflict in the Gaza Strip.
We expected a war with Hamas of 20 days. And we found ourselves, after 50 days, 51 days finishing this operation. The question is, what went wrong over here?
Protective Edge displayed impressive advances in military technology, enabling Israel to withstand thousands of rockets and mortar shells and successfully kill senior Hamas commanders. But Israel was caught off guard regarding the extent of Hamas's tunnel network.
We all knew about the tunnels, but it is quite obvious right now that the meaning of and the threat that came from the tunnels was not known, not expected, and in a way we were surprised.
Even as Israel tried to avoid civilian casualties, it failed.